What if the person you've been your whole life isn't truly you? What if the you that wakes up every morning, the you that makes choices, the you that smiles in photographs and follows the expectations of the world, is only a shadow of who you could be? Friedrich Nietzsche, one of history's most provocative philosophers, believed that most people live in quiet submission to a version of themselves shaped by others, by parents, by culture, by religion, by the subtle pressures of society. And yet, beneath all those layers lies something deeper, a more authentic self waiting to be born. Become who you are, Nietzsche once wrote. But what does that really mean? The phrase sounds beautiful, even liberating, but it carries a weight we often avoid confronting. To become who you really are requires that you strip away illusions, challenge the roles you've unconsciously accepted, and take radical responsibility for your life. It is not about adding something new to yourself. It's about uncovering what's been buried, often for years. And that journey is far more difficult than rewarding than most people imagine. We live in an era where self-discovery has been commodified. Social media tells you to be authentic, yet it also pressures you to perform for approval. Corporate slogans encourage you to be yourself, as long as that self fits within profitable frameworks. The irony is that while we speak endlessly about individuality, we've never been more vulnerable to conformity. A teacher saw this coming over a century ago. He warned of a world where people would live like sheep, content with comfort, distracted by trivial pleasures, and terrified of standing apart from the herd. But this isn't just philosophy, it's deeply human. We all know the quiet discomfort of feeling that we're playing a role instead of living fully. Perhaps you felt it at work when you suppressed your ideas out of fear of judgment. Perhaps you felt it in relationships where you shrink parts of yourself to keep the peace. Perhaps you felt it alone at night when a voice inside you whispers that life could be more than what it is, but you don't yet know how to make it so. The question of becoming who you really are isn't new. Cultures for thousands of years have wrestled with the idea of true selfhood. From ancient myths to spiritual traditions, from philosophers like Socrates to mystics like Rumi, humanity has always sensed that the greatest adventure is the inward one. But Nietzsche brought a fierce clarity to the issue, calling us to reject the easy paths and embrace the work of becoming fully alive. In this exploration, we'll dive deep into history, psychology, and lived experience. We'll uncover why so many of us struggle with authenticity, what the cost of ignoring it can be, and most importantly, how to walk the path toward becoming who you really are. Because your life's greatest task is not to be who others expect you to be, because to become yourself. To understand what Nietzsche meant by becoming who you are, we need to begin not just with him, but with the ancient struggle of identity and selfhood that stretches back through time. The question of who am I really has haunted human consciousness since the earliest civilizations began to form, long before psychology gave us terms like self-actualization or identity crisis. Ancient cultures were already wrestling with the tension between the person society expected you to be and the deeper, more authentic self that often lived in secret. Let's begin with the Greeks. Socrates, Nietzsche's philosophical ancestor in many ways, was obsessed with the soul. His famous declaration, "The unexamined life is not worth living," was not just a call for self-reflection, it was a demand for inner honesty. In a world dominated by rigid roles and communal identity, Socrates urged people to look within, to strip away external definitions, and ask what they truly believed. He was eventually executed for this radical stance, a stark reminder that seeking the truth of who you are has always been dangerous in a world that values obedience more than authenticity. Centuries later, the Stoics took a different approach. For thinkers like Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, becoming who you are meant aligning yourself with the rational order of nature, living in accordance with logos, the universal reason. They taught that your essence was not defined by fame fortune, or even feelings, but by how you acted with integrity, courage, and wisdom. The Stoic self was not a performance, but a discipline. It required facing your emotions honestly, but not being ruled by them. Even in chaos, a Stoic was called to remain true to an inner order. And then came the mystics, cross-culture Sufi poets in the Islamic world, Christian monks in medieval Europe, Zen masters in Japan. A new dimension of selfhood emerged. Here, the self was something sacred, luminous, even divine. The Sufi mystic Rumi wrote, "Try not to resist the changes that come your way. Instead, let life live through you." For these traditions, to become who you really are was not to craft a perfect personality, but to dissolve the ego entirely to become a vessel for something greater. In their eyes, the true self was not the mask you wore, but the silence beneath it. By the time Nietzsche entered the scene in the 19th century, the world was changing rapidly. Enlightenment had placed reason on a throne, but it also began stripping away the spiritual and symbolic languages that gave life depth. God was no longer the center of moral order. Science was on the rise. Industrialization was reshaping daily life, turning individuals into parts of a machine. People were increasingly told what to do, how to live, what to believe, not by priests, but by systems. Nietzsche looked out at this modern world and saw not progress, but a crisis. In his eyes, most people were becoming last men, creatures of comfort, safety, and mediocrity. They avoided pain, avoided risk, avoided truth. They wanted convenience, not character. And worst of all, they thought this was freedom. Nietzsche was appalled. He believed that modern society, for all its talk of individuality, was breeding conformity on a terrifying scale. Schools, religions, governments, even families trained people to fit in, not to stand out. And so, he issued a challenge. Become who you are. Break free from the herd. Create yourself, even if it means walking through fire. But Nietzsche's idea of the self was not static. It wasn't as though there was a real you buried under layers of society, waiting to be found like a lost treasure. No, he believed the self was something you had to forge. Like an artist with a block of marble, you had to sculpt your character. That meant not just introspection, but courage. To become who you really are, you'd have to question everything you were taught, rebel against your own conditioning, and face the terrifying freedom of choosing your path without guarantees. Historically, few people have dared to live this way. It's easier to follow scripts. Think of how many roles were and still are handed out at birth. Gender roles, class expectations, racial stereotypes, religious doctrines. For much of history, your identity was not a question, it was a command. You were told what you were allowed to think, who you could love, how you could live. And those who dared to deviate were punished. Some were exiled, some were crucified, some were forgotten altogether. Yet, in every era, there were those who broke through. The prophets, the poets, the philosophers, people who rejected the convenient roles and chose the harder path. Think of Jesus, who defied both empire and religion in pursuit of a deeper spiritual truth. Or Buddha, who left behind wealth and status to seek enlightenment. Or Malcolm X, who transformed himself again and again, challenging not only society, but even his own followers to confront uncomfortable truths. These figures didn't just find themselves, they became themselves, often at great personal cost. What Nietzsche offers us is a brutal but necessary reminder. You are not finished. You are not fixed. You are not merely the product of your childhood, or your job title, or your social media bio. You are a becoming, a living, evolving process. And if you don't take charge of that process, someone else will. In modern terms, this echoes through the work of thinkers like Carl Jung, who spoke of the individuation process, becoming psychologically whole by integrating both the conscious and unconscious parts of the self. Or Abraham Maslow, who spoke of self-actualization as the peak of human potential. Yet even with all this language and research, struggle remains the same: to peel away the false selves we inherited and uncover something real underneath. Nietzsche doesn't offer us comfort. He offers us a mirror. And in that mirror, he asks, are you living your life, or are you living someone else's dream? Are you becoming who you are, or who they told you to be? To truly grasp what it means to become who you are, we must now turn to the inner landscapes of the mind, where the battles of identity, conditioning, and freedom are most fiercely fought. Modern psychology, especially since the 20th century, has attempted to map out the terrain that Nietzsche described in poetic and philosophical language. The findings, in many ways, they confirm his haunting insights that most people are strangers to themselves, living out scripts they didn't write, trapped not by external chains, but by internal ones. Let's begin with a foundational idea from psychology: the false self. Coined by psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, the false self is a kind of mask we construct to win approval, avoid rejection, or cope with early environments that don't make space for our real emotions or needs. This false self often starts in childhood. A child learns, sometimes wordlessly, that certain parts of them are too much, too loud, too sensitive, too angry, too curious, and so, to survive, they adapt. They become what others want them to be: polite, quiet, smiling, achieving. The tragedy: this mask often becomes so habitual, so reinforced, that by adulthood, people forget it's a mask at all. They say things like, "This is just who I am," not realizing that who they are may be a carefully constructed defense against pain. Nietzsche warned us about this kind of self-betrayal. In his world, it wasn't just the church or the state that enslaved you, it was your own fear of being rejected by the herd. To break free, then, meant more than rebellion. It meant inner revolution. Carl Jung, one of the most spiritually minded psychologists of the last century, took this further with his concept of the persona and the shadow. The persona is the socially acceptable face we wear in public. It helps us function, but it's not the whole truth. The shadow is the opposite. Everything we hide, suppress, or deny, often because we fear it will make us unlovable. Anger, jealousy, desire, creativity, even our greatness. Jung believed that to become whole, we must integrate the shadow, not destroy it, not pretend it isn't there. We'll face it, befriend it, and learn from it. This is terrifying work. No wonder most avoid it. But Nietzsche's idea of self-becoming demands this confrontation. You cannot become who you are by denying parts of yourself. So you become who you are by bringing those parts into consciousness, by making peace with your complexity. As Jung wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Nietzsche would have likely agreed. The path to selfhood runs straight through the parts of yourself you most want to avoid. From a social perspective, this false self isn't just a personal problem, it's a cultural epidemic. Consider Irving Goffman's concept of dramaturgy in sociology. The idea that life is like a stage, and we're all playing roles based on the context. You act differently at work than you do with your friends. You show different sides of yourself to your partner, your parents, your boss. This isn't necessarily bad. Social adaptation is a survival skill. But when every role becomes performative, when your whole life becomes a stage, who are you when the curtain drops? Social media has intensified this fragmentation. Today, people curate identities online, branding themselves into easily digestible versions. The authentic self becomes content. The pressure to appear happy, successful, or enlightened is immense. It's no wonder anxiety and depression are on the rise. We're constantly comparing our behind-the-scenes reality to everyone else's highlight reels. Nietzsche, long before Instagram existed, predicted this shallowness. He wrote about the rise of herd morality value system that prizes sameness, safety, and surface harmony over truth, depth, or excellence. In such a world, becoming who you really are is an act of defiance. Another psychological theory that supports Nietzsche's view is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, particularly the top tier, self-actualization. Maslow defined this as the fulfillment of one's deepest potential, not success in the conventional sense, but a profound alignment with one's essence. Self-actualized people, Maslow found, were creative, independent, and unafraid to be different. They didn't conform to cultural norms for validation. Instead, they listened to an inner calling. And that calling, much like Nietzsche's will to power, wasn't about dominating others. It was about becoming fully alive. But here's the paradox. Self-actualization can't happen until our more basic needs are met. Safety, belonging, esteem, and society often exploits this. It offers us counterfeit versions of belonging and esteem, trapping us in cycles of consumerism, perfectionism, and fear. We stay in toxic jobs for financial safety. We silence our voice to fit in. We chase status, thinking it will bring freedom, only to find that the golden cage is still a cage. Nietzsche's work reminds us that liberation doesn't begin with the world changing. It begins when we stop outsourcing our identity to it. There's also a crucial social theory to consider: identity formation through external mirrors. Psychologist Charles Horton coolly called this the looking glass self, the idea that we form our sense of self based on how we believe others perceive us. If we're constantly told we're lazy or weak or unworthy, we start to internalize it. This is especially potent in childhood, where the mirrors are our caregivers, teachers, peers. And so, long before we know who we are, we're already carrying who we were told to be. Nietzsche hated this. Not the fact that society shaped us, but that we didn't fight back. He didn't believe in waiting for external permission. He believed in self-overcoming, the lifelong process of rising above your limitations, your fears, even your past self. To him, greatness wasn't something you were born with. It was something you earned by confronting life, not hiding from it. That is what the Bermensch the Overman, or Beyond Man, symbolized. Not a superhuman dictator, as some misread it, but a human being who dares to live truthfully in a world that rewards lies. At its core, becoming who you really are means engaging in constant psychological work. It's a dialogue between your inner voice and your outer world. It's the courage to say, no, that's not me, even when everyone expects you to comply. It's the wisdom to know when you're acting from fear versus when you're acting from love. It's the integrity to live with contradictions, to hold space for your flaws, and to stop performing perfection. And it's not just about pain, it's about joy. Because the more you become yourself, the more life begins to feel real. Relationships deepen, purpose clarifies, moments become vivid again. You no longer need applause to feel valid. You no longer fear being misunderstood. You begin to see that being yourself isn't selfish, it's the most generous thing you can offer the world. So, where do we go from here? Once we understand the psychological architecture of the self-false masks, shadow selves, identity mirrors, social roles, how do we begin to step out of those patterns and into the truth? The next step is to look at the impact of staying asleep and the immense cost of not becoming who you are. There is a strange kind of suffering that comes from not becoming who you are. It's not loud like heartbreak or sudden like grief. It's quiet. It lives in the background of your life, like a whispering to you in moments of stillness, gnawing at the edges of your contentment. This is the pain of self-abandonment. And for many, it is so normalized that they no longer recognize it as suffering at all. Nietzsche believed that the greatest tragedy was not in failure, but in not even attempting to live your truth. He spoke of people who lived and died as last men, comfortable, predictable, and spiritually stagnant. These are people who avoid conflict, suppress desire, seek validation, and numb their unrest with shallow distractions. They mistake comfort for peace and routine for fulfillment. But beneath the surface, their lives are marked by quiet desperation. Modern psychology backs this up. When individuals deny or suppress their authentic selves, Consequences ripple through every area of life, identity, relationships, career, and even health. One of the most well-documented outcomes is chronic anxiety and depression. According to Carl Rogers, a pioneer in humanistic psychology, much of psychological distress arises from the incongruence between our real self and our ideal or socially constructed self. When these selves clash and we consistently choose the latter, we experience inner dissonance. Over time, this dissonance becomes unbearable. Think of the man who wanted to be an artist, but became a banker to make his father proud. Or the woman who silenced her voice in every relationship, believing that being easygoing was the only way to be loved. Or the teenager who hides their identity out of fear, internalizing shame instead of self-worth. The emotional toll isn't always obvious, but it accumulates. One day, you wake up and wonder, how did I end up here? Whose life am I living? Even physical health suffers under the weight of self-denial. Studies in psychoneuroimmunology, the science of how emotions impact the immune system, have shown that repressed emotions, especially anger and grief, can weaken the body over time. The body keeps the score, as Bessel van der Kolk famously wrote. The tension in your jaw, the tightness in your chest, the insomnia, the headaches, these can all be the body's way of screaming what your voice has never dared to say. This isn't me, okay? This isn't my truth. Relationships, too, become distorted when you're not living authentically. When you present a false self, even if unintentionally, the connections you build are based on illusion. As people fall in love with your mask, not your soul. This creates a loneliness that is far more painful than solitude, the loneliness of being surrounded, but unseen. You may become a master of fitting in, yet feel like a stranger in your own life. And perhaps, worst of all, deep down, you suspect that if people really knew you, the real you, they would leave. So you keep hiding, reinforcing the very isolation you fear. Nietzsche saw this as a form of spiritual suicide. When you deny your truth to be accepted, you trade your birthright for a fragile peace. You may gain approval, but you lose aliveness. He didn't believe in playing small to keep others comfortable. He wanted you to stand tall, even if it meant being misunderstood, rejected, or alone, because only then could you attract the kind of life and people who resonate with your true frequency. Career paths often reflect this internal war. Many people chase careers not out of passion, but out of pressure. They choose stability over soul, paycheck over purpose. And while there is nothing wrong with survival, sometimes it is necessary. It becomes damaging when we never transition from surviving to living. How many people live for the weekend, dread Mondays, and numb themselves through the grind? This is not laziness, okay? It's a sign of deep misalignment, okay? A sign that somewhere along the way, they forgot to ask what they really wanted. On a broader scale, entire societies suffer when individuals suppress their authenticity. A culture filled with people who live in fear of judgment becomes one where conformity rules and creativity dies. Innovation, art, spiritual renewal, these all require courage. They require people to speak the truth, even when their voice shakes. When we collectively reward silence over sincerity, we create systems where mediocrity is safe and brilliance is punished. We lose our poets, our rebels, our visionaries, not because they didn't exist, because we taught them to doubt their voice before they could find it. And what of history? Time and again, the greatest tragedies of human civilization have come not from a lack of intelligence, but from a lack of courage. Think of all the injustices that persisted because people were too afraid to speak up, too afraid to become more than bystanders. From apartheid to patriarchy, from genocide to systemic racism. These horrors weren't carried out by monsters alone. They were allowed by ordinary people who stayed silent, who chose comfort over conscience. Nietzsche's critique of the herd was not an insult to the average person. It was a warning about what happens when when we abandon the sacred responsibility of selfhood, when we wait for someone else to tell us who to be, when we outsource morality, creativity, and purpose to institutions or ideologies. He believed that every individual carries within them a seed of the extraordinary. But that seed can only grow if you're willing to risk being misunderstood, even vilified, in the name of truth. And this brings us to perhaps the most haunting consequence of not becoming who you are: regret. Not the regret of failure, but the regret of never having tried. Psychologist Bronnie Ware, who worked in palliative care, famously recorded the top regrets of the dying. The number one regret: I wish I had had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. Let that sink in. It is not failure that haunts people in their final moments. It is self-betrayal. It is the realization that they were given this one brief, luminous life and they spent it pretending, pleasing, performing. Nietzsche tried to wake us up from that sleep. He dared us to face the abyss, not to fall into it, but to rise above it. 'Cause becoming who you are is not just about your own happiness. It is your responsibility to the world. When you live truthfully, you give others permission to do the same. When you show up fully, you become a mirror for others' hidden greatness. You inspire not by being perfect, but by being real. This, Nietzsche believed, is the highest form of power, not dominance, not wealth, but authentic being. A life lived in alignment, a soul without apology. So now that we've seen the cost of not becoming yourself, emotionally, socially, spiritually, the question remains: how do we begin? How do we move from theory to practice? How do we reclaim the parts of ourselves we've lost? The next section will guide us through that terrain: practical tools, daily habits, and mindset shifts to begin the journey home to yourself. If the journey of becoming who you truly are is a kind of rebirth, then this section is the midwife. We've examined the historical roots, the psychological maps, and the consequences of living inauthentically. Comes the most intimate, most transformative work of our practice. Because this journey isn't merely intellectual, it is lived, it is felt in your breath, your choices, your relationships, your rituals. Becoming who you are is not something you think your way into it, it's something you become, step by quiet step, through courage and commitment. So where do you begin? Not with a dramatic declaration, not by quitting your job or burning bridges. That's not transformation, it's escape. The real work starts in small, often invisible ways. It begins by building awareness of where you're not being fully yourself, where you've edited your voice, shrunk your presence, or outsourced your power. And it starts with the most radical habit of all: honesty. 1. Radical self-honesty, the foundation of inner freedom. Ask yourself with sincere curiosity, where in my life am I pretending? It could be in your career, your relationships, your spirituality. Be gentle, but relentless. Journaling is a powerful tool here. Set a timer for 10 minutes each morning and write without censoring yourself. What do I really want? What am I afraid to admit? What am I tolerating that is killing my soul? These questions are portals. They lead you inward toward the voice that has always been whispering beneath the noise. Nietzsche would have loved this practice. His entire philosophy hinges on the confrontation of uncomfortable truths. He didn't want you to be good. He wanted you to be real. And the first step toward realness is truth-telling to yourself, first and foremost, because until you see the mask, you can't take it off. Shadow work, meeting the parts you've buried. Carl Jung taught that we all have a shadow, the aspects of ourselves we hide, suppress, or deny. But the shadow isn't just made up of ugly emotions. Often, it holds our deepest gifts: pressed creativity, unclaimed power, sexuality, assertiveness, even joy. To become who you are, you must reintroduce yourself to your shadow. One way to do this is to observe your triggers. What qualities in others irritate or inspire you? Those are clues. Twice, what you react to in others often reflects something disowned in yourself. You can begin a dialogue with the shadow through writing. Write a letter from the part of you that you've kept hidden, your inner rebel, your inner child, your inner artist. Let them speak. Let them be heard. It may feel uncomfortable at first. That's okay. Growth often begins with discomfort. This isn't self-indulgence, it's integration. The more whole you become, the less approval you need. Free, values-based living, replacing the script with your truth. Much of life is scripted. We're told what success looks like, what love should feel like, what kind of person is worthy. But what if your values aren't aligned with the script? What if you've been chasing someone else's dream? Take time to define your values, not the ones you think you should have, but the ones that make you feel most alive. Is it freedom, depth, creativity, integrity? Write them down, rank them, then ask, is my current life reflecting these values? If not, where can I begin to shift? This becomes your new compass. When you live in alignment with your values, decisions become clearer, your energy returns, and life begins to feel like yours again. Nietzsche spoke of the revaluation of all values, a personal and cultural task. You are allowed to redefine what matters. You are allowed to step off the conveyor belt. This is not rebellion for its own sake. It is spiritual sovereignty. 4. Micro-bravery, daily acts of authenticity. Change doesn't require a heroic act, okay? It requires micro-bravery. Say what you mean in a conversation. Share an opinion you usually hide. Express a boundary, even if your voice shakes. Wear what you like, not what will get you liked. These tiny moments build self-trust. They tell your nervous system, it's safe to be me. Over time, the fear of judgment begins to dissolve, not because the world changed, but because you did. Consider Nietzsche's idea of the Bermensch not as a tyrant, but as someone who lives beyond the inherited limits of their culture. Each act of micro-bravery is a refusal to be small, a step toward transcendence. 5. Meditation and mindfulness, returning to the inner witness. The world is loud, and the false self thrives in noise. That's why silence is revolutionary. In silence, the authentic self has a chance to speak. Mindfulness, meditation, even for 10 minutes a day, helps you become the observer rather than the puppet. You begin to notice your habits, your reactions, your inner narratives. You become less fused with your thoughts and more anchored in awareness. Nietzsche, though often associated with chaos and intensity, also valued solitude deeply. He walked alone in nature, wrote in isolation, and believed that withdrawal from the herd was necessary for transformation. Meditation is a modern echo of that solitude, a practice of coming home to yourself. 6. Creative expression, giving form to the inner world. To become who you are, you must create. Not for fame or success, but to externalize your truth. Write poetry, dance in your room, paint badly, start a blog. Creation isn't about perfection, it's about liberation, okay? When you create, you bypass logic and touch something raw and ancient. You say to the world, here I am. Imperfect, messy, alive. Nietzsche himself was a poet before he was a philosopher. His books are filled with aphorisms and metaphor because he understood that some truths cannot be explained, they must be felt. Creativity isn't a hobby, it's a sacred responsibility. 7. Spiritual practices, touching the eternal within. For those inclined, spiritual practices offer another layer of becoming. Whether through prayer, contemplation, Sufi whirling, chanting, or sacred study. These practices dissolve the ego's grip and connect you to something larger. Not all truths are psychological. Some are transcendent, okay? And often the authentic self emerges not from effort, but from surrender. Nietzsche's relationship with religion was complex. He rejected dogma, but hungered for depth. He wanted us to replace the dead gods of tradition with a living spirituality rooted in experience. So if there is a practice that makes you feel deeply connected to God, to the universe, to your soul, follow it. Okay? Not blindly, but sincerely. Let it be part of your becoming. 8. Surrounding yourself with realness. The power of community. No one becomes themselves in isolation. Guess the journey is inward. But we need mirrors, people who reflect back our truth, challenge our falsehoods, and hold space for our growth. Seek out communities that value authenticity over appearance. Have conversations that nourish rather than drain. Be around people who ask, not what do you do, but who are you becoming? Nietzsche believed in the power of free spirits, individuals who didn't conform, but who thought deeply and lived passionately. These people are out there, and when you find them, it feels like coming home. All of these practices are simple, but not easy. They require consistency, vulnerability, and above all, patience. You don't become yourself overnight. You return to yourself slowly, like light returning at dawn. Some days will feel like progress, others like chaos. That's part of it. Becoming is not linear. It is cyclical, alive, sacred. But this much is certain. When you commit to becoming who you truly are, life begins to respond differently. Opportunities emerge. Synchronicities happen. You start to magnetize the people, paths, and experiences that resonate with your truth. And the world, once so dull and gray, begins to shimmer again, not because it changed, but because you did. There's a strange, haunting beauty in the journey of becoming who you really are. It's not a path lined with gold or applause. There are no trophies, no finish lines. You don't arrive at your true self with trumpets blaring. Instead, you wake up one day and notice something quieter, more profound to feel alive. Not in a superficial, adrenaline-soaked way, but in the deep, breath, soul-rooted sense that this life, this moment, this you, is real. Nietzsche never claimed this journey would be easy. In fact, he warned that it would be painful. To strip away the false self is to face everything you've tried to avoid. Your wounds, your contradictions, your untapped potential. K, it means grieving the years lost in pretending. K, it means disappointing people who loved your mask. K, it means standing alone at times, not because you're broken, but because your truth no longer fits the room. But the pain is not pointless. It is sacred, because every time you choose authenticity over approval, truth over safety, creation over imitation, you are reborn. Not in a dramatic, cinematic moment, but in the slow, quiet reclamation of your soul. You start to remember what it feels like to trust your own voice. You begin to move through the world with the integrity of someone who no longer needs permission to exist. Nietzsche often wrote about suffering not as something to avoid, but as something to transform. He saw suffering as the raw material for greatness. It's not the kind of greatness sold to you in motivational speeches, but a deeper, existential greatness. The kind that comes from taking your life, however messy or painful, and turning it into something artful, truthful, and alive. This isn't just philosophy, it's personal. Every time you act in alignment with your truth, no matter how small the act, you're participating in the oldest, most sacred rite of passage, the return to self. You become a participant in the unfolding of your own myth. You stop being a character in someone else's story and begin authoring your own. That, perhaps, is the most revolutionary act in a world that thrives on controlled. To be self-authored, self-owned, self-awakened. The beauty of this path is that it doesn't require perfection. In fact, it rejects it. Becoming who you are is not about becoming flawless. It's about becoming whole. It's about integrating your fears and dreams, your darkness and your light, your past and your potential. It's about standing in the truth of who you've always been, even when that truth trembles. And the more you live this way, the more the world begins to shift around you. Not in dramatic ways, but in subtle, profound ones. Conversations become richer. Relationships become more honest. Your work begins to carry a resonance that wasn't there before. You no longer seek to impress, you seek to express. You no longer perform, for love you embody it. You no longer fear being seen, you invite it. Yes, you'll still stumble. You'll still fall into old patterns, but you'll catch yourself faster. You'll forgive yourself easier. You'll return to your center more often. That's the quiet miracle of becoming. It's not about being someone new. It's about remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. Nietzsche believed that few people ever take this journey. Most choose safety. Most choose distraction. Most live in what he called spiritual mediocrity. Not because they're weak, but because they're scared. And that fear is understandable. The world doesn't make authenticity easy, but the cost of inauthenticity is far greater. It costs you your vitality, your creativity, your peace. So, if you felt the quiet ache of self-betrayal, if you've caught glimpses of a deeper self behind the social roles, if you've felt the stirrings of something wild and unspoken within you, don't ignore it. That ache is not a flaw, it's a compass, okay? That whisper is not foolish, it's divine. Listen, lean in, begin again. And remember, this is not a solo journey. Every step you take toward truth makes it easier for someone else to do the same. Every time you choose honesty over hiding, you light a lantern on the path for others. This is how we begin to heal not just ourselves, but each other. So ask yourself, not with pressure, but with gentle curiosity, what part of me have I been hiding? What truth is asking to be lived? What version of me have I outgrown? Let those questions guide you. Let them irritate you. Let them awaken you, because you are not here to play a part. You are not here to fit in. You are here to become. And the world doesn't need more perfect people. It needs more real ones. If any part of this message stirred something inside you, don't let that feeling fade. Don't scroll past it. Don't drown it in noise. Sit with it. Let it linger. Cause that discomfort, that resonance, that tiny pull in your chest. It's your soul trying to speak through the static of the world. We're taught to chase validation, to look outward, to collect applause like currency. But maybe, just maybe, the greatest success isn't about becoming what others expect. It's about remembering who you were before the expectations. So here's the challenge. Stop running, just for a moment. Stop performing. Stop curating your identity for others. Turn inward, not with judgment, but with compassion. Ask yourself, who am I beneath all this noise? Beneath the masks, the fears, the striving? And more importantly, what would it look like to live from that place? You don't need to change everything overnight. This isn't about burning down your life. It's about coming home to yourself, one honest moment at a time. Maybe it starts by saying no to something that drains you, or yes to something that scares you. Maybe it starts with one sentence in a journal, one conversation where you tell the truth, one decision that honors your becoming. Because when you begin living from your truth, everything changes. Not instantly, but inevitably. You stop feeling like a stranger to your own life. You start to walk through the world with a quiet kind of power, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't seek approval, but radiates something unshakable. And in doing so, you give others permission to do the same. You become a mirror for authenticity, a lighthouse for those still lost in the fog. No, that's not just brave, it's necessary. The world needs your truth, not your edited version, not your highlight reel, but you. So if you've been waiting for a sign, this is it. You are not made to blend in. You are made to become.